Hey, everybody. Welcome to Incorruptible Massachusetts. Our mission here is to help you understand state politics. So we talk about why it's so broken, what we could have here in Massachusetts and in our lives if we fix it, and how you can get involved. Today, we are talking about home rule petitions. And basically, what we're talking about is the fact that our duly elected city councilors cannot pass a lot of legislation in our cities. They're prevented from doing that by our state, and they're forced to send it to the state legislature, who will then vote on whether that city can actually do the thing that the people in the city want. So let's go ahead and we'll have some introductions. I'm going to go to our two superly amazing co-hosts, Berg Powers and Jonathan Cohn. Jordan, do you want to go first?
My name's Berg Powers. I use he, him, and I have several years experience in progressive political politics in Massachusetts.
Jonathan.
Jonathan Cohn, he, him, his, an activist based out of Boston with a number of progressive and issue and electoral campaigns here. Happy to be here.
I'm Anna Callahan, coming at you from Medford, she, her. And we have an amazing special guest here, Ben Ewen-Campen, City Councilor, Somerville City Councilor Ben Ewen-Campen. You want to introduce yourself?
Yes, I'm Ben Ewen-Campen. I use he, him, his. I am a city councilor in Somerville. I represent Ward 3, which if any of you know Somerville, this is Union Square and Prospect Hill, Spring Hill, and it's an honor to be here.
Fantastic. So first of all, we are going to just get a little bit of an overview about what home rule petitions are and why we have them. Who's going to jump in?
Okay, I can be quick and tell me if I'm going too long. So basically, one thing that anybody who's been trying to make change realizes is that some things have to happen on a local level, some things on a state level, some things on the national level, and it can often be confusing on what level you have to operate, right? And in Massachusetts, that becomes especially the case, as many of the changes that you might want to make on the local level require state approval first, which is in that kind of that request for state approval is called a home rule petition. And this structure dates back to the 1960s, when prior to that, the kind of Massachusetts Constitution recognized the state as supreme. Municipalities really did not exist without granting a power of the state, yada yada. And the state had to deal with a bunch of minutiae from municipalities that had very little actually kind of endowed power in that context. An amendment to the Constitution in the 1960s gave municipalities some greater power, but with large carve-outs that cover a lot of area that we associate with lawmaking. In particular, so what those were, those carve-outs to what municipalities still could not do on their own were regulating elections, other than specific things laid out, levying, assessing, and collecting taxes, borrowing money or pledging the credit of the city or town, disposing of parkland, enacting private or civil law governing civil relationships, except as an incident to an exercise of an independent municipal power, and defining and providing for the punishment of a felony or imposing imprisonment as a punishment for any violation of the law.
Can I stop you for a second? Let me jump in for 1 second. I'm going to break it down a little bit. That was a mouthful.
Yeah.
And if we compare a little bit to other states, like I moved here, I lived in California for a couple of years. And while I was there, there were cities passing rent control, there were cities passing, laws about minimum wage laws about workers, so other states, and plenty of other states, cities can pass laws that relate to landlords and tenants, employers and workers, but in Massachusetts, cities cannot pass those laws. I just want to make that clear before we go on, and then pass it back to you, Jonathan.
Yes, exactly, and that's a great point. Is one of the most broad parts of that is just this idea of civil relationships that the municipalities can't pass law governing. The landlord-tenant relationship is a civil relationship. The employer-employee is a civil relationship. So depending on how one chooses to stretch that carve out in its application, so many of the things that we think of when we think of passing laws would run right up against that barrier. And the same thing when it comes to taxing authority. we also think of, when we think of policymaking, we think of the passing of things and the funding of those things. And that barrier is also something that will always end up hitting.
Yeah. So here I got to jump in with a little bit of opinionating, which is that, I am completely in favor of states protecting the powerless against the powerful, right? Our states need to make sure that they protect the rights of people to get equal education, the rights of people to, not be oppressed, all those things. And cities should not be able to pass laws that remove those rights. But we're talking about the state literally having a law in place saying that the cities cannot protect the powerless. That our state has has a constitutional law in place saying that we must protect the powerful from democracy.
Yep.
It hurts. Having been in a state where you can pass things like rent control and whatever at the city level is painful. It's painful. And I think it's painful. And I want to pass this over to Ben, because I think part of what's painful is people get elected to city politics. And if they're not in an incredibly strong and progressive city council like Somerville, they end up feeling like, I can't do anything. My hands are tied. My time here is useless. So before I pass it to Ben, let me quickly just mention a few of the policies that Somerville has passed home rule petitions for, has handed them to the state. And so one is a right to purchase, which means that when a property is being sold, the tenants have the first opportunity to purchase that property. A real estate transfer fee, so that when property is being sold, especially if it's being sold to folks who are going to be a landlord, that there is a tiny, tiny little fee that's assessed that can go toward affordable housing ideas. And here's one of my favorites, the retirement board to divest from fossil fuel companies. So I want people to understand that the state of Massachusetts prevents our cities from divesting from fossil fuels. It is not allowed without the permission, without a vote of the state house. It is completely absurd. Okay, Ben, there, that's my diatribe. I'm passing it off to you, and we would love to hear how this has affected Somerville.
I think that doesn't even count as a diatribe. That was a clear-eyed statement of facts. I think I just want to start by emphasizing one of the points that you just made, which is we don't need to pretend that every city and town in Massachusetts should be able to pass every single law they want. You can imagine all types of exclusionary laws that could be passed if we threw open the floodgates. I think almost everything that we're going to be talking about today is really just about protecting working families, protecting tenants from abuse by landlords, stabilizing neighborhoods, making our communities more affordable and diverse, and making our democracy more transparent and accessible. And these are the types of things that, as a city councilor, it's often just incredibly frustrating to try to explain to the public why we can't make common sense improvements in their lives. And I'll just say, by way of background, so I was elected in 2017. I was one of several new candidates, and all of us ran on issues focusing on housing affordability. And we ran, very clearly, this was a platform that was widely embraced across the city. Several new city councilors running on issues specifically around affordable housing were elected, and we felt a very strong mandate that this was clearly where our community wanted us to be focusing our energy. And while we have passed a lot at the local level that is within our authority, the really big policies that would make kind of transformative improvements in people's lives, all of them require state approval. And without getting too deep into the weeds on this, I always kind of like to put this in terms of what we wish our housing market looked like, as opposed to what it currently looks like. So I'll give you an example. I have there's a building in my neighborhood where there's a number of elderly residents who've lived there for a long time as tenants, and they had a kind of benevolent landlord for many decades who kept the rent below market. Now, if that building goes up for sale, the person who's going to buy it is going to pay 2021 prices, and they're going to have a huge mortgage, and they're going to immediately try to literally double or triple the rent. and they're going to find new tenants who can pay those new rents, and the tenants who have been there forever are going to leave Somerville. That's how it currently works. You can imagine the way that we would like it to work is that those tenants have an opportunity to work together to buy the house themselves, or if they don't have the finances, which is very often the case, they could partner with a city or a local nonprofit to buy that entire building, keep the tenants that want to stay, and make that permanently affordable. And in order for the city to have the money to do that, we want to have a fund that is paid for by a very small tax on developers and speculators that would be generating tens of millions of dollars a year in our current market that would make those sales possible. And if we were to be able to do that, these tenants would be able to stay in the neighborhood. We'd have much more kind of sustainable long-term neighborhoods, and we would have more permanently affordable housing. Currently, every single step of that process is illegal under Massachusetts state law. So we've passed a series of home rule petitions, what we call the real estate transfer fee. As you said, it's a small tax on non-owner occupants buying and selling property in Somerville. We have the tenant's right to purchase, which would allow tenants to get the first bite at the apple to buy the building they live in when it goes up for sale. And another policy that I don't think we actively have a home rule petition on, but Somerville is unanimously in support of, is rent control, which is that's the big one, right? Kind of everything else that we do is whittling around the edges. It should not be legal to double or triple the rent on low-income senior citizens or anyone else for that matter.
Exactly. Can I just jump in
and all
for
of these are
one-
currently blocked.
I apologize for interrupting, but I just got to jump in for 1 second. People who are listening may not realize that Somerville is 2/3 renters. 2/3 renters. So we're not talking about like just college kids. Like we're talking about people who they may have spent their whole lives here and they're still renting.
Yeah. I just want to say also, because rent control sounds, when people hear rent control, what they hear is the price is set and it can't go up. That's how the media talks about it. That's how it always gets things. It says simply that you can't raise rent more than double inflation. That's it. Not even inflation. Like the things that we're pushing is like double inflation, right? So, currently some of the rents are getting 25, 30% year to year out of control without any improvements, any sort of like changes, right? If you do those things, let's say you are like, I really want to make this place nice, you then get to raise rent, right? Like it's not even that. It's just, if you don't do anything, you can't just increase costs. You can't just do whatever. And so I think it's important because I always want to say what it is, because I think people get really freaked out, and it's actually really simple. It's a really simple policy to keep people sort of in things. Some other things too that I'm sure Somerville would love to pass that are just things like some things that other cities across the world have passed to try to keep control of the flows of money, because a lot of the flow of money, especially in the Boston, less so Somerville, is just out. It's like it's sovereign wealth. It's people who are trying to hide money from their dictatorial governments, and they have unlimited amounts of it, and they don't care what happens. So some things that you can do are require that people live in the homes, like that you have residents and you tax them if they don't, if they're just trying to park money. That's a way, again, that keeps them control, because you want to have people live in the places that they have. You can't currently pass that tax, right, without a home rule petition. So there's just a lot of things.
Little story about that. So we were recently looking to move, and we looked at a place. And as we were looking at this apartment, the realtor guy says, "Oh, you're gonna love the landlord. She lives in Connecticut. She owns like 25 properties here in Somerville. That's her goal, is just buy a ton of properties in Somerville." And in my mind, I was like, I don't think I'm going to love this person. but this is what's happening, is like we have no idea and no way to know who owns our properties. And so, Ben, I want you to talk about this more, and why, part of why we're highlighting Somerville is one of these unique places where, first of all, as 2/3 renter, like all of these policies are clearly what your constituents need. No question. Pro-renter policies, because we're 2/3 renter. But Somerville is also a place, and I have to shout out our Revolution Somerville, because they were involved in the 2017 elections, the 2019 elections, these elections. They've been doing a great job electing fantastic progressives like yourself. And because of that, Somerville is in a unique position that it, in fact, can vote for all these home rule petitions and can send them to the state. So Somerville has really been at the forefront of passing home rule petitions and sending them to the state and having them rejected. And I would love to hear your thoughts about what is causing these requests from your constituents, clearly policy that your constituents need, from not being approved by the state.
Well, I think one thing I want to emphasize, I am very proud of the work we're doing in Somerville, and I do think that we are leading on a number of policies, but a lot of what we're doing is not actually unique to Somerville. And to take one example, the real estate transfer fee, there is a broad coalition of cities and towns that are passing these things, because the housing crisis is not just in Somerville, it's not just in Boston. One of the leaders of this coalition is Nantucket, the island of Nantucket. And just to be clear here, the situation in their housing market, it's a little bit different from Somerville, but it's the same at the core. It's basically, there is no place for the workers on the island to live, period. There is not enough physical structures. You know, the city, the town of Nantucket wants to hire people to work for the city. They don't have places for them to live because the average home price, is astronomical, and there is not some secret stash of buildings for working class people to live in. And what's really remarkable, talking to our colleagues in Nantucket, it's universally supported. They're the people who lead the charge for the real estate transfer fee in Nantucket are real estate brokers themselves.
Wow.
The tax that they are proposing, I mean, as of a few years ago, it was 0.5% tax on properties over $2 million and only on the value above $2 million. So if you sell a $2 million house, there's zero tax. It's just
God
$1
forbid
over
you
that
pass
gets
that.
taxed.
That would be
0.5%.
terrible.
It's really, really hard to understand how something like that couldn't pass. Did you just lose me for a sec? Sorry.
You're back.
And I think, I don't pretend to understand the inner workings of the State House, but I think when it comes to the real estate lobby, the only way that I can interpret it is that it's like the NRA or something. You're not having a good faith discussion about the merits of the policy. There's we don't give an inch. You will not do anything that cuts into real estate profits. And so what we are trying to do is participate in a statewide coalition that is not just Somerville, but is really broad-based in communities across the state, to give cities and towns the power to create their own real estate transfer fees to address their own affordable housing crises, because they are a little bit different in different communities.
I feel like your point actually really hits the nail on the head in terms of which things end up passing and which ones don't in home rule, because something that's like very narrow in Nantucket, if I'm a legislator and I don't like the idea of something like the real estate industry taking a hit, I see something passing in Nantucket, meaning that that's going to start spreading to a number of other municipalities. And I, as the kind of legislator supporter, or I, as the real estate industry, don't want that to happen, even though the flip side, that's exactly what should be happening. And it is like, you do have municipalities organizing specifically around that. And it does create the structure with home rule petitions, where the ones that end up being easiest to pass are the ones that have like a very narrow single municipal interest behind them, whether it's, let's say, a nomenclature change in a municipality, like when municipalities have been kind of recognizing that we shouldn't be using terms like board of aldermen, or not everybody might be male, to change those names, or sometimes small governance changes. There's nobody's opposed in the legislature. It sails through in kind of very pro forma basis. But when suddenly it could mean something positive spilling over, and even the fact that the people with invested interests live in somebody else's district, and the way that helps kind of create the legislative inertia that ends up leading for so many of these to not move forward.
I have to bring up something because you just mentioned something that I actually, like, people don't realize. I remember a couple of years ago looking at like what the state voted on today. And it was like, they voted to approve that the city of Worcester could spend $34,000 to hire a dog catcher. And I was like, what? I was like, what are our state legislators spending their time doing? Like, why are all of these things? And you mentioned one that's like frivolous, right? Changing the name of the, why can't they change the name Board of Aldermen without the state? How on earth can we expect our state legislators to be doing all of those things, making votes on all of those things when they don't live there, right? And it has nothing to do with their town. And why are they spending their time doing it? Sorry, a little bit of a rant.
No, just quickly on that point, it's a generally absurd thing when you realize how much that stuff does kind of gum up legislative works. I mean, if you look at how many of the bills that actually become law and they end up that they pass are home rule petitions, they're sick leave banks for state employees that they have to pass, they're land conveyances, and so much of these things that are so minor and that they have to do so much process for.
Yeah, just for regular folks to understand. So if the legislature didn't have all these home rule petitions to pass, like if it just did regular business, it would pass 4, sometimes 5 bills a year, right? It's just not passing other things. It's the majority of the things it's doing are these sorts of things. And like their own version of this, which is sick leave for their own employees, or like a day, official Massachusetts day, right? If you like wipe out some of these just nonsense things, I don't want to say nonsense for the individuals who need them, right? Like I'm glad that they're providing these care for people, but if these things that don't require even most of the legislatures to show up to do it, if you swipe out these things, they're passing next to nothing. And if you ever look at a catalog of it, it's really ridiculous how little they actually do in passing legislation, how much time these things take up. I just want to give another flavor of what they're passing around these things. So most of the time, these things are just literally like, they affect one person. Like I wanted to 200 people need to vote on something that affects a person, right? Like a person, one
or 10
employee
or 20 or 50 people.
I mean, what?
Or 10
or
people, 20 or 50 people
who actually show up, right? But it's in right. Oh, you're saying the actual effects of people, the sick banks, but a lot of the things, it's like one person, right? Or even if it's like an alcohol license, it's that business, right? Like it's just a lot of work for these one things. But then if you get policies that have the ability to affect people's lives in a positive way, all of a sudden, it's like the legislature doesn't even know it has this power. It's not just that Somerville's home rule petitions are sort of coming and getting discussed and the merits are things. They disappear into the legislature's crap, like just nothing happens, right? Like they're not asking Ben to come testify. They're not asking his opinion on it. They're not debating whether or not this is a good policy for the people of Somerville, right? Because that's what you imagine. Oh, well, they've discussed it and decided like this isn't the way to tackle this issue. They're not discussing it. They just flat out pretend like these things don't exist. So if there is, that's what's, I think, so maddening about this process is people who are serious about fixing their towns and cities, people who are serious about pushing policies that can make people's lives better at those regular things. They go to the trouble of legislating on those things and literally nothing happens. Nothing, absolutely nothing happens. It goes into the legislature and nothing happens. There's no vote. There's no hearing. There's no hearing. There's no discussion. There's no anything. It just disappears. I mean, think about that.
I think it's so important to yeah, thank you. What Jordan said really touched a nerve, because what's so frustrating about some of these policies is that members of the public don't know who is responsible for holding them up. And therefore, there is no opportunity to affect change. So, my constituents, they know where I stand on these issues. They've seen me vote on them repeatedly over the years. And if they disagree with me, someone could run against me. And if they win, that would send a message, right? When it comes to our, for example, real estate transfer fee, or I'll just give another example. Somerville recently passed a home rule petition to allow immigrants to vote in our local elections. This is something broadly supported. It was a unanimous vote supported by our mayor. We would love to do it. We don't know who is keeping that from getting to a vote. We don't know who would vote for it or against it. And there's no way to apply political pressure in a situation like that. And I think when people describe things as a structural issue, this is a perfect example of that, where the structure is set up to make it almost impossible to pass things where several hundred legislators from across the state would have to stick their necks out on an issue that would benefit working class people in Somerville. But kind of there's no upside in it for all these legislators to go out on a limb and support it. The structure is set up to make it extraordinarily hard to make this kind of change.
Yep. A moment to let that sink in.
In case people are
I do think,
curious-
though, sorry, it's important. I don't want to leave it on a purely pessimistic note. Like, part of what we all have to do is think about building those statewide movements and coalitions to affect this change. I think I do want to say it's very easy politically for local officials to say, well, we can't do that. It's impossible. The state will never approve it. And that may or may not be true. In often cases, it is true. And you want to be transparent with your constituents, but you don't stop there. I think that one of the reasons it is important to pass these home rule petitions and to testify on statewide legislation that might be considered a long shot is to continue to activate people across the state who might be able to reach out to their state legislator and say, hey, I just heard about this thing that Nantucket is doing, that Somerville is doing, that Cambridge is doing. Is that something that we could do here? And to build that movement, and it's not going to happen overnight, but if we don't do it together, it's never going to happen.
And I'm going to mention one thing that we talked about in a previous podcast, but I think it is worthy of repeating, that it's not just long shot policies that we need our city councilors and our other elected officials to vote for. It is even things that may not be legal. So when I was on a commission in Berkeley and we were trying to pass campaign finance reform laws, somebody said, well, we shouldn't pass this because it looks like from, the state of Arizona that the, Supreme Court of the state of Arizona said that that's, unconstitutional because the Supreme Court has already decided that, money is speech and corporations are people, blah, blah, blah. And somebody spoke up and I was so happy to hear this. And it really transformed my thinking about politics. He said, it is not our job to support the Supreme Court's terrible decisions. We need to pass policies, even if we know that they're going to be turned down by the courts, because that is how we can move forward on these issues. Whew, with that, any final words, Jonathan?
On the idea of trying things, even though they're difficult, it just reminds me of the line about how you miss 100% of the shots you don't take. Kind of like you lose that, like you'll lose, like you're winning 0% of the battles you don't even fight. So if you're going to have at least a chance of even moving the ball forward and creating the conditions where somebody in the future could win the fight, it needs to start at some point.
And I am let me just say, I had a little moment of gratitude to be here with all three of you, because we are all those people who we're going to lose and we're going to keep fighting, and then we're going to lose, then we're going to keep fighting, and then we're going to win a little bit and then get beat up again, and we're going to keep fighting. So thank you all. It is a pleasure and an honor. Ben, thank you so much for being here and for all the work that you do in Somerville.
Ben, thanks for being such a shining light on as a legislator. We really appreciate the work you do.
Oh, thank you all. And I want my last words. This is a secret for the public. City councilors and legislators, we are all copycats of one another. And I think that one of the things that is kind of scary is that if a good policy passes, people start copying it. I'll just take, for example, in Somerville, we passed a ban on facial recognition technology used by the government. And within several months, cities across the state had done it, and there was momentum to pass a state law. So I think it can seem like a small victory at first to do stuff at the local level, but these ideas spread, and they can spread very quickly when the time is right.
Fantastic. Wonderful. Thank you, everybody. Thanks to all our listeners, and we'll see you next week.